So now let's look at how to create a progress dialog. What we can do is basically we're just going to hook this up to that same button that we had already created for the reset, and we'll just make it show a progress this time. So there's two ways we can go about this. First, I'm going to show you the way that's using the existing framework that we have right now, where we have the show dialog, and we're just going to use the onCreate dialog to do this. So in order to do this, what we'll need to do then is we're going to get rid of all of this code that does the alert dialog. And instead, what we're going to do is create a new progress dialog. And we have to give it a context, so we'll do this. And then we'll do progress dialog. Let's go ahead and set a message for it. So we'll do a set message, and then we'll say doing something. And then we're also going to set the style, and then that will take a style of one of two styles. Basically, we can either set the style horizontal or style spinner. In this case, we're going to set it to style spinner. And then we're just going to return this progress dialog. And then if you recall, Android is going to handle actually showing this for us. But we have a little bit of a problem with the progress dialog, which is if we show it here, we need some way to cancel it, some way to dismiss that dialog. And typically that's going to be when you're done doing some background process. So what we're going to do here is we're going to simulate that happening, and then we're going to go ahead and close the progress dialog when that finishes. So before we return our progress dialog, we're actually going to create a new thread here. So what I'll do here is I'll do thread and then a thread can take a runnable in Java, and then we can override a method for run here. So what we'll do on the run is we'll do a thread.sleep, and we'll just sleep for like 3 seconds. And then once we're done sleeping, then what we're going to need to do is then dismiss that dialog. The only problem is that we have to be mindful of the UI thread here. And if we try and do some action on that thread from another thread, it's going to throw an exception and give us a problem. So the way that we get around that is we basically use what is called a handler, and we declare that handler to do something, and then we send the handler a message. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to declare a handler in our class. So we'll create private handler, and we're going to do new handler. And a handler is going to basically take a override here that is handle message. So we can do and then in here we could pass in a message and then do something. In this case, we don't care what the message is. If we get called, then we're just going to dismiss the dialog. So we're actually going to need to keep a reference to that dialog also. So let's go ahead and make a reference here. And then we'll make that dialog.dismiss. So once we get this message, we're going to call dismiss. We're going to call handler.send empty message, and then we'll just put a 0 in there because we don't care what the message is. And then we're actually going to need to set this dialog before we return it. And then we'll do dialog equals progress dialog, and then we'll just go ahead and return our dialog here. So now, just to recap what's happening here, is when onCreate dialog is called, we're going to create a new progress dialog. We'll set the message, we'll set the style, and then we'll also create a new thread here. And in that thread, we're going to override the run and have it sleep for 3 seconds and then send an empty message to our handler. Then we're going to set the dialog and return it. And actually, after we set the dialog, let's make sure that we're actually doing something here. So we need to do thread.start. So that will start up our thread, and then we'll return the dialog so then Android will show it. Now once this 3 seconds expires, because this is running in a separate thread, then it's going to send an empty message to our handler, and when our handler receives that message, it's going to then dismiss the dialog. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see what happens here. Okay, so we have our protein tracker app. I'm going to hit the reset button. We see the dialog shows up for a couple of seconds, and then it disappears. And that's really all that happens with the progress dialog. So let's go ahead and look at what happened here. So real quick, looking at this one more time, we have the dialog showing up. We've got another thread running in the background. When that thread finishes, it sends the empty message to the handler, and then that dismisses it. So let's quickly switch this over to the other way of using progress dialog, which is basically to make it so that we don't manage the dialog with Android, but we do it ourselves and do it in the one-liner for showing the dialog. So what we're going to do here is, instead of calling show dialog, we're just going to create the progress dialog all in one shot here. So we're going to do progress dialog dot show, pass in the context, and then we just give it a title and a message. So we'll say waiting, and then the message will be doing something. And that will actually show the dialog right away, and then we'll actually need to make this be the correct this, which will be the main activity.this, so that we have a context. And this will show the dialog right away. It actually returns us a copy of the dialog, which we're going to need because we need to be able to dismiss it. So we set that to our member variable for dialog. And then I'm going to take the code that we were using here to start this new thread. And then we're just going to go ahead and run this right here. So now Android isn't going to be managing this dialog, and we're just going to be showing it at one point here. And so let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. It should be the same. We're expecting the same behavior. Okay, so we have our protein tracker. I hit the reset button. It says waiting, doing something, and then it disappears. And that's it for the progress dialog. One thing that you may do here is, you're probably not just going to create another thread. There's some other applications where it's going to make more sense for some other event that's happening in the system to call back, and perhaps you'll still use the handler. A good example is in my pacemaker application. It basically has to go out and get the GPS. And so when it's going to get that GPS signal, it calls into an Android system call, and then it gets an event back from Android when it gets a location. And the first time I get a location, that's when it dismisses the progress dialog if it's showing. So that's the typical use of this. But you could do it either way. I prefer to kind of use the onCreate dialog, just because if you have multiple dialogs, you can do them all in one place here, and it kind of makes more logical sense to me. There's no dialogs that I'm managing separately, but you can do it either way, and it's not that hard. The trickiest thing really is understanding how this thread and handler work.